G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. I know it's a Monday, but look, we'll get into the groove of things. Now today, as always, of course, we have a lot to speak about. What we do need to look at is the cancelled Ramstein meeting, as well as an article that has come out talking about the potential for Ukraine to accept land concessions to end the war. So we'll go over that in length. We have a little bit more information about that Su-34 that went down, and was it an F-16, was it a mechanical failure, was it a pilot failure? We went over that a little bit yesterday, but we'll go over it more today. But I do believe that is a good scope to test amongst wherever your sources that you listen to get information on this is. Use that as a bit of a bearing to see whether they're pushing truths, narratives, backed by actual founded evidence, or by opinions, narratives. Anyway, then we need to have a look at the maps, as there are some interesting changes, some geolocated footage, and some movements here, there, in Ukraine and in Russia, in Kursk too. And we'll look at some evacuations in Kursk also. But what I first want to start with is, once again, speaking about war crimes. Now, throughout this war, the amount of war crimes has been systemic. It has been massive. From blatant execution through to the use of gas grenades, execution by drone, targeting of soldiers who are hors de combat, and especially this footage then being celebrated widely online by supporters, even if this is in clear violation of these treaties. Ukrainian and Russian soldiers are all meant to be protected under these treaties. Regardless of the uniform they wear, then they are then protected. This is what these laws are here for. Now, let's have a look at what has come out today. And I can't show you then the photographs, although some people do speculate over what the photos show, but I'm sure you can find it somewhere. Russian bastards have once again violated the rules and customs of warfare. 9 Ukrainian soldiers were shot dead in Kursk. It became known from our sources that here on October the 10th, they shot the drone fighters and their associates in the area. Here it gives a geolocation. Additional details of circumstances are being clarified. But it is known that the boys entered the position thinking they were in the relative rear, but were forced to come into contact with the enemy and were shot back. However, the number was limited and they were forced to surrender. So they were forced to surrender, but these were drone operators who went into an area of which they thought was in relatively the rear. The situation in Kursk is not happy. The defence forces are carrying out stabilisation measures, but it is extremely difficult to restore what has been lost. More ground has been lost in Kursk today, as well as more evacuations on the other side of the border. We have discussed the situation with other officers and commanders at various sites. UAV crews should take more seriously the possibility of an enemy breaching their position and not neglect safety. Now, there's a few interesting things about this. I want to speak on this in length. Now, from the comments that I was reading from Russian and Ukrainian pages, not just for this specific situation, but just overall, is there is a special hate and a lack of sympathy for drone operators. Now, with the videos and actions that we see filmed, shared, celebrated, as a former infantryman, I would never justify any of these actions. It is completely horrible. It is a war crime that has been committed, but I can see why there is a special hatred for that of the footage we see of drones targeting soldiers who are surrendering or hors de combat. That is not one in a blue moon. This happens basically daily. We see this then celebrated. Now, especially as well, this happened in Kursk. Now, internationally, these Ukrainian soldiers or the Russian soldiers there, these are protected under the Geneva Convention and other treaties as well, as are, of course, the Russians within Ukraine. They are protected under this. Although, domestically, Russia has declared the Kursk offensive as a terrorist operation, therefore likely being more lenient towards investigating this, at least domestically, if there can be any more leniency than there already is against some of these filmed actions throughout the nation, the belligerent nations in this conflict already. But sadly, I think that we'll see very few war criminals come to justice, even if they filmed themselves doing the actions, regardless of what uniform they are wearing. I think a lot of this stems from, well, not only history, but the US's recent reaction to the International Criminal Court's warrants for Israeli leaders. And to me, this was the hope that the sort of moment that hope was lost for bringing people to justice, because it showed a clear sign of bias in the system from the most powerful country in the world. And the US said that these warrants were outrageous and that the ICC has no jurisdiction. And many comments I see today under the photograph and posts about this specific action that has occurred is I see the photos that are all alluding to Israel's actions, even Israel's actions today. Now, I guess some of these are trying to justify the unjustifiable. Now, two wrongs doesn't make a right. But one thing it is doing is it does point out the bias in the media and the systems. But many, of course, I understand, are just trying to justify actions. None of this is justified. Whether Russia, the US, Ukraine, Israel, anyone else, all of whom have enough video evidence over the past decades or past months or past years of clear actions that need to be investigated and or people brought to justice, we have seen no attempts, at least even, to self-police these grave breaches of treaties and have chose to ignore any internal or international policing as well. And this is a slippery slope that we are already beyond escape velocity, and it will make future war more brutal and even more limitless than it may seem right now. So we spoke about Kursk there, so let's continue to speak about Kursk. Now, I believe throughout this month and early next month, we will see Russia really push to try and retake Kursk, what is occupied by the Ukrainian forces at the moment. Because I believe that October the 5th election, if there is some negotiation around this war, around that period, Russia will want to have that under control, because this is the primary card at the moment, at least in territory, that Ukraine has on the table. That's, say, 550 to 600 square kilometres. So they'll try and pull this back in. So let's have a look at this. Of course, this is Ukraine, the centre, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, the green and blue within Ukraine's borders, area where Russia has been and has either been pushed out of or has withdrawn. But when we're speaking about Kursk, this is area where Ukraine launched its offensive into here to attempt to take some Russian territory here for their, quote, exchange fund. But I believe that the primary goals were not reached. I think the primary goal was probably further into Kursk, potentially that nuclear power plant. Now, let's firstly look at changes today. So we see between yesterday and today, we do see a shift in around Korenovo. Now, these Russian troops in here had said to been surrounded for a long time, and it looks like that has now been unblocked. So there is a change in here, and we did see this from yesterday. So we go back to, whoa, where am I? We go back to what we saw and then come up then to today, and we can see where this is shifting, even if for some reason my date on here is not moving. Regardless, we can see what is shifting here. Now, there are a few interesting pieces in here. Let's firstly look at this. So, of course, we have Kursk, and on the other side, we have Sumy. Now, we see that Ukrainian media, this is Kyiv Independent, releasing today that a total of nearly 37,000 residents have been evacuated from Sumy Oblast, including over 6,400 children, as efforts are ongoing to evacuate more residents under expanded mandatory evacuation orders, as Sumy Oblast Military Administration said. So they've expanded these mandatory evacuation orders because of further attacks here. This gives us an idea that Russia is actually pushing harder in this area. We have spoken about strategically long-term, the best decision for Russia may have just been to actually just hold it in place and make Ukraine put the amount of resources, both man and machine, into here just to hold that territory into winter, so Russia have an easier way on other areas in the front line. But again, we will see as Russia is pushing very hard down in the south. But Noel reports does show that there is a Ukrainian advancement in here today, so just out of Martinovka. Now, we can see Martinovka right in here, so let's go back. So here's showing where this road then bubbles out in the grey zone here. Noel reports is showing that the Ukrainian forces made some ground in here. He doesn't show where this has been pulling back, shown by the deep state map itself. But we do believe Russia is launching to try and retake some of this position. Have troops been taken off other areas of the front line? Well, that is up for speculation. Have some specialists, drones, engineers, whatever, potentially also entire units? Well, that is still speculative. But we do know there was a lot of recruiting, local recruiting in Kursk to form units around this specific area too. So it could be a lot of that now coming to fruition. And realistically, the attacks we've seen in here, has this had really any noticeable effect on other areas of the front line as far as Russia's ability to launch and sustain combat actions? No, not yet. It has not. If anything, it has actually increased that in some ways. So let's look at other areas of the front that are changing. We'll turn this on. Remember, the red check is areas made within the last 24 hours. Now we'll come down into the southern end, Vuhledar, and what we can see is more of a shift into this Zolote-Niva. Remember, about a week ago, we did see some armoured vehicles launch an attack on here, and it does look today that Russia has expanded further control. Now we come just east of here. We have Vodyany, Vuhledar. Now, in the northern direction, it does look like Russia has further expanded its buffer zone out from Vuhledar to some 2.4 kilometers, so a mile and a half-ish out from Vuhledar, of course, that area that came under control in the last couple of weeks. But here we have Vodyany, and what I want to look at right here is the Syriac update just in this direction. Now, this can be just a little bit hard to see, but we have then Vodyany and Antonivka, and what we can see is that it's showing that there is more control out around the sort of basin of Antonivka here. It's very, very difficult to line these maps up. I was looking before, and I was like, what the fuck is going on? But we see run down here. To be honest, it's very similar. It's probably just where the grey zone is shifting is where the grey zone is showing is where Syriac is showing his update there. So he's actually showing less there. Everyone goes, oh, Syriac's this. A lot of areas, Syriac sometimes shows less than Deep State, and Deep State shows less in other areas than Syriac. This is why, if one person's relying on one map, don't do that. Mapping would be incredibly difficult. That's why I use other people's maps. Let's look a little bit north of here. And of course, we have the Pokrovsk front, and we have Shkernay in here also. Now, we see a Russian advancement out from then the train line into the further western blocks here. Now, we have a good idea of why this has, of course, moved here. We have then Russian soldiers putting up a flag in here. Now, there's actually two geolocations in here, but both are very, very close, and there's two flags being raised. I'm not sure which geolocation is which flag, but they're literally one street apart. So for the case of movement, it's not going to really matter. This is at least one of the geolocations here. So you can see where this is sitting, these blocks right sort of on the edge of where it is showing in here. Again, backed up by movements on, of course, the maps. But we do have a Ukrainian advancement in here, in and around Seledov. We know Seledov is likely to try and be taken before Pokrovsk. This is a large area, as you can see. So let's have a zoom in on this, and this is now the Syriac map. Does show actually very similar to then the Deep State map, probably a little bit, it's pretty close around Martinivka, maybe just a little bit more in and around these two spoils of mines. Recent Russian bombardment confirms that Ukrainian army recaptured Korotchenko mine, so here, and the surrounding areas at the outskirts of Seledove, while Russian forces completely secured the adjacent locality of Mykolaiivka. On the other hand, Russian army made new advances west of Shkernay, so exactly where we showed you down in here by this map, and the Ukrainian advancement here. Now, what we have spoken about, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, is realistically, the ability to have a front-on attack into Seledove is probably very, very difficult, but the flanks are the most vulnerable aspect. We have seen Russia working around to Shkernay to get more flank here. We have seen, of course, Russian armoured vehicles right up in and around this paddock here, as well as that motorcycle that made it well into Seledove as well. So I think we'll see more securing of the flanks to try and envelop that before we see more attacks within. Maybe that's why we're seeing that push out on the northeast. Now, let's have a look then around Ukrainsk as well. So where we're looking is, of course, this is Ukrainsk, Shkernay, and we have a Noel Reports' map here, and here's showing then to Shkernay movement here too. Sorry I didn't show you that one. It was my labeling was slightly off. So definitely some changes in and around here. Now, let's go up, and this is something interesting that I hadn't seen on this map, was more movement out from Ivanivsky and across, of course, this canal that runs in here into the flank of Chasiv Yar as well as above in Horovkia in the deep state map today. Now, one thing we do know is a lot of other maps are showing that Klishkivka up to in through like here, that this has come under Russian control, including some Ukrainian maps also showing this, but you can see movement around Chasiv Yar. Of course, Russia will try and get Chasiv Yar, of course, to get it down into Konstantinivka, into Kramatorsk. The way to get supplies into Konstantinivka, if Russia can cut off Pokrovsk, will limit this. So this is all sort of, these are not mutually exclusive offensives at this point in time. But up and down the front, these are all the updates I have for you today, and I showed you Kursk. Now, let's look at what Der Spiegel, of course, a Russian paper, has said. So what we do know is that Ramstein has been cancelled. Ramstein, I like the band. I don't know much about the meeting, but the official visit program is therefore only scheduled for Friday. That Biden wants to meet the federal president, but he's visiting. But of course, this is cut short due to then the hurricane that was taking place in Florida. But the meeting is now off the table. We thought it was just delayed. It means an imminent Ramstein meeting will definitely not take place because of the war in Ukraine. The package that would have been announced was announced by Scholz on Friday. Of course, this is the nearly 400 million euros for Ukraine. Let's look further into this. Further decisions on Ramstein format will most likely only be expected after the outcome of the US election. So that meeting has been canned, which is a big blow to Zelensky. Of course, he wanted to present not only the victory plan, but other opportunity to get more funding at something like Ramstein here. So it refers to a report in the new data. Biden actually wanted to come to Germany October the 10th for several days, but shortly beforehand, White House cancelled the trip for, of course, Hurricane Milton, but it hasn't been moved. It has been now canned. So look, we speak a lot about the future of this war. We don't know how long it's going to go. We don't know if it's weeks, if it's months, if it's years, it's decades, or it falls into some sort of Cold War. Of course, that in decades. But we need to look at what Der Spiegel has said today. Now, I will let you know, I did translate this through Google Translate, so if it's a little bit dodgy, apologies. This isn't the full article. You can go and look at that if you want. But he's saying the Russians had more of everything: people, missiles, drones, and the use of motorcycles and armoured vehicles, which we're seeing that tactic develop more and more. The state of mind of the war of attrition. Ukraine is facing its third winter of the war, and it could be the hardest, perhaps even the decisive one. Of course, Russia has picked up its attacks against the energy system. The optimism that Ukrainian advance territory in Kursk in August, inspired among many, has evaporated. Even though the Ukrainians continue to occupy parts of the region, the country, it seems, has slipped back into the grim state of mind of the war of attrition with a slow, apparently unstoppable Russian advance. The war is gnawing at both sides, the aggressor and the defender. But at the moment, it looks as if Ukraine could be the first to run out of strength, will and resources. The soldiers are exhausted and society is getting tired of war. The population is increasingly criticising the president and his powerful staff. Of course, when martial law is enacted, Zelensky has a lot more power than otherwise and won't run then further elections, which doesn't have to run under martial law, although a lot of people are asking for this as it continues on. Of course, we've seen media, limits put on media, limits put on opposition parties. Also, 18 to 60-year-old men can't leave the country, but now we're 2.5 years into the war, people that were 15 and a half, 16 when the war started, having to return. But on the other end of that, if you're 58, you hadn't been conscripted, you can then fuck off. Western supporters will not abandon Ukraine anytime soon. But there is also little evidence that the partners will make Kyiv strong enough for successful offensives with massive new arms deliveries. This is why I say that I don't know. People go, oh, Kamala's the best option. Kamala's already in power. Do you think there's going to be some massive shift, 180 degrees, 200% more arms deliveries if she gets into power? No. If it continues at the same rate now, I have a very pessimistic outlook of how that actually looks in the future. I think it could get far, far worse. I think Putin knows this as well, that he knows that if you just want to be able to predict more of the future of the arms deliveries, that Kamala is far, far, far more predictable than Trump. Trump gets into power, far more unpredictable. The last thing you want in your opposing side is massive unpredictability. This is why I believe we haven't actually seen more attempts to actually hit and take out Putin. Because who would replace him? Putin is somewhat a lot more predictable than whoever else would come in. We don't know about the predictability of that. We don't know the extremeness of that then also. Volodymyr Zelensky, who is currently travelling through Europe again, would like a big push to force the Russian ruler to the negotiating table. But it does not look as if this dream will come true. Of course, what Zelensky's victory plan is based off is enough force put onto Russia and enough arms into Ukraine that Russia themselves will go, we're pulling out, we're handing over Putin, we're handing over Shoigu, we're handing over Gerasimov, and then we want to negotiate, here's all the 1991 borders. The amount that would take would be extreme, if possible at all. Outgoing American President Joe Biden continues to deny Kyiv permission to use American weapons to fire at military targets deep inside Russia. If Donald Trump, who has boasted that he can end the war within 24 hours, is elected, the situation in Ukraine could worsen. However, Ukrainians are not expecting miracles from the Democratic president candidate Kamala Harris either. It will be very interesting to see what happens on November the 5th. I wish I was there, but the old bloody thingo bob. But it'd be very interesting to look back in a decade and go, what was the right decision in hindsight? What would have been the right decision for this war? Because it's going to go one way or the other, and history will tell us which way actually was the better decision. Whether it's Trump or Harris, the Americans will slowly but surely withdraw, a senior Ukrainian official in Kyiv told Spiegel in confidence. He sounds pessimistic overall. So this Ukrainian official in confidence. He says the prognosis is poor. I feel ya. He says he's worried about the morale of some of the troops. People don't really want to fight anymore. He is also worried about the tensions between people. The injustices of war could tear society apart. And I do wonder about men in the future, those men who did volunteer or who were conscripted to go and fight, and those men that did pay to go into Europe somewhere. I wonder what the tension is going to be between those different soldiers. There's a hell of a lot of that post-world wars of guys that did and did not fight. And of course we know all around the world with social media, with other things, tensions are higher more than ever between people. Bit of compromises. For the first time since the Russian invasion of 22, the Ukrainian capital is seriously discussing scenarios in which the country forgoes the complete reconquest of its occupied territories, almost 20% of Ukrainian territory for the time being. The official admits that they had a false idea of victory. We believe that victory must be the unconditional surrender of Putin's Russia, but it cannot be done without concessions. A deal must also be beneficial for Russia. One of the issues in this is what victory has been told to the population of not only Ukraine but all around the world, that nothing other than the 1991 border and the arrest of Putin and this and this and this is victory. Anything less than that is not. So that is where the sticking point can be, where I think just survival at all was a huge victory. When we look, if you were to go to 2021, early 2022 and go, how would it look if Russia invaded here? You'd have the same outlook as if US invaded Mexico. Now, I think anything there was a complete victory to have any amount of sovereignty at all. But this could have, like we spoke about in the one before, problems in societies as well. The problem in here too is, one, it's assuming that Russia will actually come to the negotiating table at this. Right now, if you were to look at what cards does Russia have, what cards does Ukraine have, well, the 20% may bump up for a negotiated end here, because Russia is looking like they could more continue the war. And if Ukraine do say, look, we're not negotiating, tip, and then come to the table and go, we want to negotiate, I think the Russian diplomats would take that and the negotiating staffers, things must be worse than we think. Okay, when we are requesting even more. We will see. We can discuss in the comments. Since the Ukrainian counteroffensive failed a year ago, the Russian attackers have regained the initiative. In February, they captured the small town of Avdiivka. It's not that small, which, like Vuhledar, it's not, more significant, was once a symbol for Ukrainian resistance. In the summer, the Kremlin troops gained territory faster than they had since the first 2 weeks of the war. Ukraine did conquer a strip of Russian territory, Kursk, but it withdrew its forces from the difficult front of Donbas, which remains to be seen whether this plan will work. Personally, I still think that this has had a net negative effect on the front line, along with the majority of people I feel share that feeling. But the Russian resources are not infinite, he says, this military expert. The losses of armoured vehicles in particular are so great that domestic production cannot keep up. Although it will be very interesting to see, because some of the loss numbers we have, History Legends has a good video about this. He says, yeah, but some of those vehicles have been hit and counted as lost, then hit again, counted as lost and repaired, and some vehicles have been counted multiple times. We will see. Domestic production may not be keeping up, but what is the repair and bringing ones out of storage as well? It's taking into account here that Russia can't get vehicles from North Korea or China. What may happen in the future, we're seeing more talk of North Korean troops going into Russia, tanks, artillery, whatever. That could change things. In the coming year, the Russian advance with such troop transporters will therefore slow down. The Kremlin army will have to adapt its tactics even more, away from frontal attacks towards flanking attacks in smaller groups. It's not they will have to adapt, they have already adapted and done this. Whether through a lack of armoured vehicle or whether through learning and adaptation of war, probably a bit of column A, a bit of column B, particularly taking lessons learnt from Wagner in Bakhmut. We have seen, of course, movement down to smaller attacks in smaller groups with those scooters, with the motorcycle, and that is working on the front line. Large losses, yes, but a loss doesn't mean that attack has been a failure, depending on what the end goal of the attack was. We have definitely seen that moving forward. It's questionable how much striking power the attackers will have after their recent gains in territory. Time will let us know. With everything in this war, we're going to get the answer to these questions. It's just going to come in time. Gatti, who regularly visits the front in Donbas, was of the opinion recently as the summer that Ukrainians would have enough reserves to stop the Russian advance beyond Pokrovsk. So up to summer, he believed this. Since the Ukrainian operation in Kursk, I'm no longer sure. So he's changed his mind if Ukraine does have enough reserves to stop this advancement. For every square kilometre in Ukraine, the Kremlin sheds a lot of Russian blood. The Ukrainian officer Nazarenko reports the entire Russian companies were destroyed within a few hours. According to Western estimates, up to 1,200 soldiers are currently killed or injured every day, although we see many saying it's 1,200 are killed every day. Again, I don't know how people get these numbers. If a missile hits a bunker 300 k's away, 30 k's away, I don't see how we can get to digit numbers. So far, the Russian commanders have been able to replace the dead and wounded, says Nazarenko. Every 10 to 14 days, they would throw new troops into the fight. Reliable estimates, I don't think anything's reliable currently. I apologise. I don't care if it's Russian, Ukrainian, Willy, Western, fucking Southern. I don't think there's any estimate till after this war, and I think we'll still get a bracket. Put the number of casualties, the Russian side of up to 200,000 and around 80,000 on the Ukrainian side. Now, after the war, we're going to see a huge impact on Russia and Ukraine with men with massive amounts of PTSD. We'll then see an increase in suicide, like we will see in like the war, like after we've come out of war, and this war is absolute hell, as well as the amount of asbestos and mesothelioma that guys will have from the amount of asbestos that guys have inhaled from artillery striking buildings. After the war, we could see even more casualties, and that will have a huge effect economically on Russia and Ukraine. In addition, there are tens of thousands of dead and injured civilians, missing people and prisoners in Ukraine. Several million Ukrainians have fled abroad and millions are living under occupation. The divorce rate is high and the birth rate is low. To call it a demographic crisis would be an understatement. The country is bleeding dry. Threatening division of society. The winter is also threatening to be harsh beyond the front. Russia has damaged and destroyed half of Ukraine's electricity production. The Kremlin wants to freeze Ukraine into submission. Ukrainians' optimism and resilience are not collapsing, but they are crumbling. In the first year of the war, according to a survey, 80% believed in a Ukrainian victory. This year, 60%. At the same time, the willingness to compromise is growing, particularly among young people who may end up sitting in a trench if the war drags on for years. If Ukraine were admitted to the EU and NATO, 47% of Ukrainians would accept the freezing of the current front line. And again, I don't know exactly where or who they're asking for these studies, but it would be very interesting to see if a deal was put to the people of Ukraine, not the government, the people, and said, look, the war will stop, admission into the EU, rebuild, economy, this, that, everything, but this amount goes. I'd be very interested to see if that was actually put into a vote, into a plebiscite might be the right word, but I'd be very interested to see what would actually come of that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but therefore it's going to have to be a brutal, bloody years of war to continue. However, there are also forces in the country which do not want to have anything to do with negotiations with Russia, and that could become a problem for Zelensky if he really does seek compromise. The Kyiv political scientist Volodymyr Fezenko described this group as the Militant Patriots. Fezenko assumes that they make up around a third of the population. That's a hell of a lot. The army, like society, is also divided along these lines. and we've spoken about this, like I spoke about recently, that the messaging for victory has only been at this very high level. What if there is a compromise? How then does that look within Ukraine as political scientist Vladimir Fizenko says, with militant patriots who have had massive amounts of losses? They have sacrificed so much for their nation on that promise. How does that then look? Not in the first week, but in the months following. And if there is any unrest, like any unrest we see in, say, the US, that will be as well, I believe, pushed as well and helped along by Russian intelligence campaigns also. The dream of NATO. There is a widespread agreement in Ukraine about the country's major goals, the longed-for accession into the European Union and NATO. This is the only way to ensure my son, who is now 12 years old, does not have to fight against Russia when he grows up. Zelensky, in his much-quoted new victory plan, which he presented to the White House in September, is also said to include rapid security guarantees for Ukraine, which would be the equivalent of NATO accession, although we know entry into NATO beyond the end of the war is unlikely to happen, and wherever the war ends, it still, at this point, could be a toss-up. This Friday, Zelensky will present the victory plan to Scholz. We'd speak about the cancellation of Ramstein. Scholz, of course, has said how we can get out of this war situation and achieve peace more quickly than currently seems possible. But how Ukraine supporters intend to proceed will only become clear after the US election. In Kyiv, there's a lively discussion about the West German model, so it's sort of like a application, but not a complete application. It's a security guarantee, but not of it. Republic was part of NATO during the Cold War, although JDR was part of the Eastern Bloc. However, the inner German border was not disputed or fought over. The idea NATO could take in Ukraine before the end of the war is therefore completely illusionary, says the same scientist. Zelensky wants that. He's a maximalist. But NATO will not commit to defending Ukraine under current war conditions. If NATO was going to do that, they would have already have done it. Like I've said, the NATO rhetoric is that this war is existential for NATO. If that was true, the Germans, the French, the Brits would have no problem sending in these long-range strikes or more of these systems, or even people on the ground beyond what is already there as far as some people helping with missiles and those systems. So there is a rhetoric around how it actually is looking as well, and that would frustrate the shit out of Zelensky, I am sure. But again, could we see NATO involved in somewhat if there was some level of like false flag to draw in? Now, we spoke about the F-16, F-Su-34. Now, Fighter Bomber has shared this, a couple of these articles coming out, and so many people confirming it's confirmed. There's zero fucking evidence of this as well. And again, this should be your barometer, I guess, to look at who's saying this, who's not. Okay, who believes in narratives, propaganda, and who believes in evidence as well. Now, Fighter Bomber has spoken about this in length. I'm not going to go all over this, but speaking about how there is a war of information too. But he did then interesting points out as well that our aircraft fight, but we do not lose them to enemy or friendly fire, not always. In most cases, equipment and crews are lost to failures, incorrect actions of the crew, or loss of orientation in space. Planes and helicopters have to attack and evade enemy missiles without anything except instruments, which do not always show the correct information. Not all of our crews are aces. There are young ones, and there are recent graduates who are insufficiently trained or completely untrained crews. This is very interesting. I think I would have rather have a plane taken down by an F-16 than actually admit to untrained crew or insufficiently trained. I actually think that could be a bigger problem. That could be a larger issue being pointed at than, hey, look, a fucking fighter jet came, shot down our jet, and we lost it. Yeah, that fucking happens in war. A missile coming at us to go at 60 Gs in a turn, rather than insufficiently trained or completely untrained crews. There is still a bunch of different factors that can lead to a plane or helicopter crash. I do think we could see particularly more planes going down as well to maintenance as we see these are flying harder and harder, more and more missions, dropping heavy bombs, and of course trying to spool up the amount of crews to train also. So realistically, F-16, did it shoot it down? I would at this point say, well, there's no evidence to suggest that. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense hasn't even claimed that they have intercepted a Su-34. And like I've said, the level of evidence needed for a claim against a Su-34, Su-25 is low at best. And we haven't even seen that claimed yet, nor any evidence of it. Realistically, it's probably incorrect training of crew or a mechanical failure. Probably very likely a Su-34 with mechanical failure for how hard these are flying. Anyway, legends, have a great day. I'll speak to you tomorrow. We're on the countdown for the last videos before I go offline. Look after yourselves. Thank you. Bye-bye.